Welcome everybody. This is Matt Hardy, the Program Director for Planning and Policy here at AASHTO. I'd like to welcome everybody to our the fourth, I think, in our 12-part series on transportation asset management, where we're focusing on different topics for each webinar. The webinar series is being sponsored by both FHWA and AASHTO. So when you see an AASHTO person, say thanks. When you see FHWA, say thank you. We've had, I think, great success in these so far. We typically have about 150 attendees or connections, and we've estimated about between 5 to 10 people per connection. So I think we have really good attendance from across the U.S., Canada, maybe even some other sort of European, Australian folks as well. Today's topic is on asset management and risk management. This is the fourth of a series of the initial four. These webinars are being held every 2 months. The next one is going to be on asset management and this concept of performance-based planning. We all know about MAP 21 and the emphasis on performance-based planning and programming and risk-based asset management plans. So I think this webinar, talking about risk, plus the next one talking about performance-based planning, should put us all in perhaps a more comfortable position in getting ready for the requirements of MAP 21. So the next one on asset management and performance-based planning is going to happen on July 10th, 2013 at 2 p.m. As a reminder, these take place on the second month of every other month at 2 o'clock. They go for about 90 minutes to an hour and a half to an hour and 45 minutes, depending on how interesting, I guess, or how much discussion there is for the actual topic. These webinars are recorded. More information on them is available at the AASHTO Asset Management website, which is TAMwebinar-04. You click on the left-hand side, it says webinars. As I said, we have recordings of the previous three, so if you weren't able to make those, you can go there and view them. And they're also, we did a 4-part webinar series, I want to say a year ago, maybe 18 months ago, on the AASHTO Asset Management Implementation Guide. If you want to know more about the implementation guide, that 4-part webinar series recordings are also available there. And I also want to promote FHWA's book club on the AASHTO Implementation Guide. Those webinars take place, I want to say, on the 4th Wednesday of the month, also at 2 p.m. And you can find out more to register for that. You can go to FHWA's website on asset management. If you have any suggestions, comments, ideas for future webinar topics, or have any questions for the presenters during today's webinars, during today's webinar, you can submit your comments or question using the webinar's Q&A feature. So if you look at the top bar, there should be something called Q&A. Type in your question, and we will address it at the end. One other plug before I talk about phone logistics: the Subcommittee on Asset Management and the Subcommittee on Maintenance of AASHTO are having a joint meeting. This meeting is taking place July 22nd to the 25th. It'll be in Burlington, Vermont. If you want more information, again, you can go to tam.transportation.org, or you just go to AASHTO's website, click on calendar, and there's more information there. So for today, for the phone logistics, everybody please mute your phone. Because some people don't mute their phone, or they might not have a mute button, we put the system into what we call a lecture mode, and that mutes everybody's phones. If you're one of the presenters, you're going to have to hit *6 to unmute your phone. Once you're finished presenting, you'll have to hit *6 again to basically remute or mute your phone. I think that's pretty much it for phone logistics. Information about today's webinar, where you can get more information. With that, I'm going to turn it over to Nastaran, FHWA's Asset Management Program Manager. Nastaran?
Thank you, Matt.
You're welcome.
Good afternoon and good morning to everyone joining us today. I am Nasran Sodatman of Federal Highways Office of Asset Management. I am stepping in for Steve Gay today. Steve will be joining us for our next webinar on July 10th on asset management and performance-based planning. Federal Highways with ASHA Subcommittee on Asset Management is pleased to sponsor this webinar. We feel it's a great way to connect with the asset management community and bring people together to discuss a series of important topics. Our first set of 4 webinars wraps up with today's webinar on asset management and risk. However, the series as Matt, our next 4 webinars have already been announced, and you can there are more information on our website and also ASHA's website regarding the next webinars. Risk management in the context of asset management is relatively new to many of us. In asset management, we use a broad definition of risk management encompassing an agency-wide framework that complements asset management and addresses both opportunities and threats. There hasn't been much work done in this area until recently. Federal Highways recently produced a 5-part series of guides addressing risk-based transportation asset management, and you will hear about this shortly. Also, the ASHTO Transportation Asset Management Guide addresses risk management as a key component of asset management. The recent reports on risk management and the guide help us to identify and mitigate threats to an effective asset management. Interestingly, since the guide was published, we have seen an increasing focus on program and enterprise risk management. MAP 21 has also brought new attention to this area by requiring state DOTs to develop risk-based transportation asset management plans. I am looking forward to hearing today's presentations, and here is Yana Park of Spy Pond Partners to give an overview of today's webinar and review today's agenda, also introduce our first speaker. Thank you. Yana?
Thanks, Nasran. Hello, everybody. Today's webinar, as has been mentioned, is on asset management and risk management. We're going to hear from 3 presentations and 5 speakers in the 3 presentations, and they will be going from a strategic level down to an operational level. So 3 very distinct views on asset management and risk management, and as you will see as you go through today's webinar, the different aspects of this topic are many. And we hope that what you'll hear today will cover the basic principles of risk-based asset management and illustrate these differences. And together we will explore that range of strategic to operational and how those connect and how you may be able to apply it in your setting. All right, so what we're hoping that you will learn today is that you'll be able to learn lessons learned and ideas and knowledge that's already been gained by your peers, and that you'll be able to build a greater working knowledge of the key concepts and definitions in the area of risk-based asset management, and that you will be able to get a few ahas that you will be able to take and apply in your own setting. And this may also be a way for you to be introduced to and seek further knowledge after today in thinking about how risk-based asset management can benefit you and also serve you ready to meet MAP 21's requirements, where there is a specific requirement to develop a risk-based asset management plan. Well, I'm just going to quickly go through the agenda today. We're going to have 3 presentations, and the first presentation we're going to hear from Gordon Proctor of Gordon Proctor and Associates and Shobna Varma from Star ISIS Corporation, and they're going to talk about their recent work they've done for federal highways on addressing risk-based asset management. Next, we're going to hear from Tim Henkel from Minnesota DOT on their on integrating risk into their decision-making process. And our third and final presentation will be from Florida DOT on FDOT's emergency management approach and its relationship to asset management. We're going to have question and answers at the end. So if you look at the top of your the screen, you'll see a Q&A option. So you should ask your questions in that Q&A. And we're going to just take it in the order that they come in, and if we can't answer all of them, we'll try our best to get them answered and posted on the websites, both Federal Highway and Asset Management and ASHTO's. And then we will, I'll direct the questions to the appropriate people. So if you have a specific person you're asking a question for, you should just indicate that in what you enter. Our first presentation is from Shobna Varma from Star ISIS Corporation and Gordon Proctor of Gordon Proctor and Associates. Shobna and Gordon co-wrote a 5-part series for the FHWA Office of Asset Management on risk-based asset management. This report, the set of reports define risk management and illustrate how it is an emerging practice used by state DOTs. Both Shobna and Gordon work frequently with federal highways and state DOTs on this topic. Now I'll turn it over to Shobna and Gordon.
Thank you, Hannah. Appreciate the introduction. Good afternoon and good morning to all of you. As Nastran said earlier, MAP 21 has a strong focus on risk-based management. Hannah, next slide, please. Thank you. Federal Highway Office of Asset Management, as both Hannah and Nastran mentioned, produced 5 reports recently on how risk-based asset management can complement other transportation asset management processes. These 5 reports are now available on the FHWA website, so you can access them from there. They define and illustrate how risk management can be applied to managing transportation program of assets, both and other operations in the agency at the agency or the enterprise level. In the reports, we define what risk and risk management are. Next slide, please. Risk, as we say in the report, risk is a positive or negative effect of uncertainty or variability upon agency operations. So it's both the negative and the positive. The fact that the risk is both positive and negative, and it relates to uncertainty, is something that we'll touch upon in a later slide. We define risk management as cultures, processes, and structures that are directed towards the effective management of both potential opportunities and threats. So really all threats, all risks, previous slide, please. Okay, thank you. All risks are not threats. Risks do create opportunities. And part of what risk management is about evaluating which opportunities you can capitalize on and which risks you need to mitigate. Next, please. As we said earlier, not all risks are negative. Risks are not just threats. While risks do include threats, a big component of variability of risk is variability. Risk can also be caused by change or by uncertainty, but risk can also create opportunities. And risk focuses on uncertainty as much as any of these other areas. So if you have a plan, so for example, if you have a plan, and if there are certain factors that cause uncertainty as to whether you will be able to implement your plan or achieve the objectives of your plan, by understanding the risks, you are able to discern which of these you can capitalize on and which risks you need to mitigate. So risks really are not just about physical threats. They can be about achieving your goals that are tied to your to things like your customer satisfaction objectives. That is, to achieving your infrastructure conditions and your infrastructure performance or your safety objectives. Risk management is really about overall agency objectives and not just about achieving these specific goals related to physical health condition or performance of specific assets. So when thinking about risk, we think about what is the risk to achieving our broad institutional objectives. So risk can be viewed in a variety of ways. Next, please. Risk can show up in your operational aspects of business. It can be anything that impedes an objective or creates a new opportunity for you. For instance, economic risk can be caused by price increases, by inflation. There are decision risks that can be caused by bad information or bad data. If you're not confident about your data, you're always going to be at risk about the decisions you make based upon your data. So there are external risks caused by climate change, seismic risks and floods. Also, there are risks associated with new technologies. So though new technologies are promising, there's also risk of failure and risk of concern that there will be loss of waste of resources. Sometimes there's a risk associated with steep learning curve associated with deploying new technology and upfront costs that one has to incur. But there are also opportunities that are caused by things like new materials, new processes. And for all of these risks, there's a risk that things may not work out well or not work well enough. Risks really run across all the gamuts of operations and can affect anything from your financial operation, your strategic objectives, to your daily operations, and then to the physical assets that we traditionally think about when we're discussing risks. Next, please. As Nastran said, MAP 21 really initiates an era for U.S. transportation agencies with emphasis on performance management and asset management. And this aspect of risk management is a relatively newer concept. It states that states must develop risk-based, performance-based asset management plans for at least the national highway system. So this is a new thing, but there is a real logic to including risk management with performance management and asset management. Next, please. So asset management and performance management seek to increase the reliability and predictability in the outcome of systems and operations. So that is the definition and the intent of quality, which is ensuring reliability. So, but there is going to be, and you can expect that, in the world that we live, there is uncertainty and unpredictability. So, and that's the place where risk management can be a good complement to asset management and performance management. What risk management really does is helps you identify the variability and the unpredictability. That is the threats and the opportunities that exist in the real world. So the opposite of reliability, which is variability, and risk management is the tool that helps one deal with variability. It helps us reduce the variability in the desired outcomes created by these threats and opportunities that arise in the real world. Next, please. So the reports that we talked about illustrate several U.S. examples. So while we may think that we do not really use risk-based asset management practices, in reality we do. We may not necessarily think about it in that fashion or describe them that way. And so the report explains those practical things that we do and how we use risk management in our day-to-day operations. It discusses the areas where you may not think about a risk management approach. For example, taking a risk management approach to your information systems, your entire class of critical assets, such as the national highway system and bridges. That is an approach to risk management. Applying risk management to climate change, seismic threats, those are all very commonly done in many states. And applying a risk-based asset management to investment decisions. So it's very common in the financial industry to see risk-based decisions, a risk-based approach to financial decisions. So risk management can be applied to the financial decisions that you make with your transportation assets and with your programs. Risk management can be very helpful when you face changing legal or political requirements. It also provides you an opportunity to inform your decision makers that the ability to achieve your stated objectives may well be at risk because of the volatility you face, because of the legal or political requirements that are being imposed or are changing. These political and legal requirements can cause variability in your ability to achieve your objectives. So risk management does help bring that together. It helps showcase and present the risks associated with your trying to achieve your objectives in this changing environment. The other aspect is that risk management is very scalable. One very good thing is that transportation agencies for the longest time have been using risk management approach to address project-level risks. And the same logic that we've been using in addressing project-level risk can also be applied when you think about agency and program-level risk. So in the report, what we do is we discuss 3 levels of risks. We discuss that the agency level risk, which in the private industry is often referred to as enterprise risk. We refer to that in the series of reports as agency level risk. These are the risks that are very high level risk to an agency, and they can cause concerns or the lack of ability to achieve the agency's objectives and goals. So these tend to have an effect throughout the organization, and they are generally external. They can include things such as declining revenues, lack of political support, change in leadership, and broad range of aspects pertaining to the overall nationwide aging infrastructure. So these kind of big overarching issues can cause agency risk. These are often outside the control of staff and have to be dealt with at a very high level in the organization. But they can have a tremendous impact upon the ability to achieve the overall asset management objectives of an organization. These would be overarching risks that can affect the entire agency, the agency's ability to achieve its asset objectives, but also its strategic objectives. Next, please. Then there is the program level risk. We show in the diagram to your right the 3 levels of risk. The second tier that we talk about is the program level risk. These are the risks to your bridge programs, the pavement programs, the maintenance programs, and so on. There are distinct risks that can be managed at the program level. For example, data quality and availability. If you're not satisfied, for instance, with the quality and availability of your pavement data, or your bridge data, or your maintenance data, you probably have a risk associated with managing those assets, your bridges and pavement programs. If your state has a very diverse and decentralized project selection process and perhaps a not so strong approach to preservation, these can create risks. You may have a very finely tuned asset management plan developed, but if it cannot be implemented in the way that you intended it to be just because of the disparate selection and preservation strategies, then it can have an impact and pose risk to your achieving your pavement and bridge and maintenance program objectives. So those are some program level risks. You may also be at risk because you do not have good forecasting tools. If you're not certain about how your system is going to perform 5 years from now or 10 years from now, then you are at risk of achieving those long-term objectives and of sustaining your asset conditions into the future. Another example of a program level risk is loss of institutional knowledge. This is something that all transportation agencies are facing at this time, is a tremendous turnover of institutional knowledge, of subject matter experts. And so sometimes you can have a few key personnel in your bridge department or your payment department or your maintenance area, and their retirement may cause some challenges to your attaining your entire bridge or payment or maintenance program objectives. Next, please. Then there is the third tier of risk that we talk about in the reports, which is the project level risk. This is something that most DOT personnel are routinely using. They're comfortable with it. These are the traditional risks that we talk about in the context of cost and scope and schedule. And then there are also project risks because of unknown factors that can affect your project delivery or achieving it, completing it in a timely fashion, that such as geotechnical, environmental issues, or issues related with utilities or railroads. So those are some of the other project level risks. So we do emphasize in the report that if you're familiar with risk management at the program level or the project level, you can take those same concepts and apply them to the higher tiers, that is to say at the program level and the agency level. And you can actually have effective risk management at those higher levels too. Next, please. So one of the reports looks at risk to networks and corridors. And you know that inherent in the MAP 21 is the risk-based asset management, risk-based management focus, first on the national highway system, and then it states voluntarily on other networks. And so because of this overriding importance of the national highway system, it is obvious that it has led to an emphasis on the national highway system. So if trade-offs have to be made, then MAP 21 says your asset management plan should be focused on NHS, on all of these critical, important networks. And the rest of the network, it says, is voluntary. So MAP 21 also puts an emphasis on corridors and freight corridors, freight networks. Therefore, a risk-based approach that emphasizes those networks will very logically complement the MAP 21 emphasis upon an NHS and the important freight networks. There are several examples in place across the country, in transportation agencies that we have pulled out and included in the report. And they show how asset management can be scaled up. Risk-based asset management can be scaled to different levels and applied at different levels in an agency. Next, please. So this is a heat map of an example from the North Carolina DOT. What it shows is that, if you look at the map on the heat map, it shows three categories of networks, and it shows three different targets: one for the interstate, one for the primary, and one for the secondary system. So you can see in the heat map that the conditions and targets are higher for the interstate, a little lower for the primary, and yet lower for the secondary routes. So this is one of many examples that illustrates and reflects a very risk-based approach by the DOT. They're putting the higher targets and the more critical networks, they're investing a lot more on that, expecting a higher target of accomplishment on that as compared to the some of the other networks. So the intent being that these are at higher risk of economic failure, and any disruption can cause a higher impact on the traveling public, and it can also cause higher cost to fix. So these sort of allow us, transportation agencies, to demonstrate how some of the challenges that they face in making trade-offs. I know that developing a risk-based asset management plan seems a lot like challenging, but it really is an opportunity, as is shown in this example here. It allows us to have a platform that when we have to make these very difficult trade-offs, we can use a risk management approach to explain and educate to decision makers about what's involved and what the difficult trade-offs that we are making. Gordon?
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Shobhita. Shobhita had summarized the first three reports, and I'm going to summarize the last two. And the fourth report deals with managing risk to asset management policies. And these would be the types of risk that would be owned by the executives, the director, by the commission, or people who are at a high level of the organization. And they tend not to lend themselves to formulaic solutions such as audits or quality assurance reviews. These can be really thought of managing risk at this level as a verb and not as a noun, that involves a very active practice of continuously surveying the horizon, and in terms of dealing with the unpredictable and variable activities that may impede your asset management plan. In this report on your right, you will see a theoretical policy risk register. This would be the risk that would be of highest importance to carrying out this theoretical agency's asset management policies. And as you can see, the highest risk identified is inadequate information system, budget shortfalls, inadequate asset inventories, failure to perform proper maintenance, price increases, and loss of experienced staff. As you can see, the likelihood and the consequence of each have been identified. A risk rating has been developed. They've been ranked and put into a heat map. So with this type of information, you could communicate to your board, your commission, the public, or the legislature that these are the critical issues that may impede you from achieving your asset management policies. And it's also a good reason for these to be managed at a high level. Some of them may provide opportunities and not just threats, and the board can take advantage of those opportunities. Next, please. The fifth report looks at using asset management to dealing with external threats such as hurricanes, climate change, seismic events, and so on. Three critical ideas dealing with handling and responding to crises such as hurricanes or climate change events, and that is redundancy, robustness, and resiliency. And asset management contributes to each of them quite well. By having sound assets, your redundant evacuation routes are kept in better shape and more likely to survive an event and be useful. Assets that are hardened and managed well are more likely to be robust. And sound asset management practices and programs will make you more resilient because you're better able to plan for, absorb, and respond to events after they occur. Next, please. We're all going to be dealing with more unpredictability caused by climate change. And risk management can really help with the tools for planning for the unpredictability caused by climate change events. For instance, good asset inventories can help you identify which assets are most at risk. And with sound inventories and sound asset management plans, you can also more quickly prioritize the response after an event and be better prepared for it. Next slide, please. There's some real analogs for risk-based asset management. It may sound like something that's new, but we look at things such as the Caltrans and Washington DOT seismic retrofit program, flood planning programs, climate change modeling, and one long-standing program are rockfall programs. And when you look at how the logic in a rockfall program, and you think about scaling that logic up to all your assets, you have within your agency already a good analog for risk-based asset management. It's a matter of scaling that up to other assets and using the logic of rockfall programs to give you a model for developing risk-based asset management programs across a broader number of assets. Next slide, please. So in conclusion, we hope that these examples provide useful models and templates as you develop your asset management plans. And as Shogun has said, although risk-based asset management may sound new, its principles are quite common to many things you already do. And if you take those and scale them up, you'll probably be more comfortable with what risk-based asset management is. And I would like to reiterate what she said, that risk management is a great complement to performance and asset management because they try to ensure reliability and predictability, and risk management helps you deal with that which is unpredictable and unreliable. So with that, I'll turn it back over to Fiona.
Thank you, Gordon. Thank you, Shobna. And I think this is a very good segue into our next presentation from Minnesota DOT, where they've really approached risk, performance, and asset management in a cohesive way. Our next speaker is Tim Henkel. He is the Division Director of Modal Planning and Program Delivery at MnDOT, and Tim is going to speak to us about their approach to integrating risk into decision-making and into their basic strategic framework of the agency. Tim.
Thanks, Fiona. Can you go to the next slide right away? Thanks to FHWA and AASHTO for this opportunity to be a part of this really important webinar. As Fiona said, I'm going to take a few minutes to talk about the ways in which MnDOT links components of risk management and asset management in order to improve our strategic and operational performance. Before I do that, however, I think it's important that I highlight our risk practice and give the audience some context to what I'm going to present. First, we at MnDOT employ asset management as but one leg of a three-legged stool that also embraces risk and performance management. In simplest terms, we employ risk-based asset and performance management to ensure successful delivery of our strategic goals and objectives. Second, risk management is implicit in our transportation business practices. We set strategic goals and objectives like all DOTs, but successfully meeting these objectives is always uncertain. Internal and external risk events can impact the achievement of the objectives that we've set here in the state. Likewise, we set performance measures and we develop asset management systems that optimize the investment decisions that we're making. Again, risks can impact the achievement of performance and of asset optimization. The point I'm really trying to make here is that we know that risk is pervasive in our transportation business here in the state, and therefore we also feel it is incumbent upon us to develop explicit enterprise risk management strategies, methods, and tools as a key component of our three-pronged management approach. The key word there is enterprise, not selective risk management strategy, methods, and tools. In the end, our risk-based asset management planning and the plan that we're developing is one of many important components in MnDOT's three-pronged management approach. With that context, my presentation will highlight how we at MnDOT have successfully developed an integrated risk management analysis into decision-making by covering three key areas that have evolved within the department. First, the emergence of this concept and the reality of enterprise risk management. Second, how we're applying risk management analysis in our highway investment planning. And last, what we're doing with respect to asset management planning in applying risk management analysis in the first transportation asset management plan being developed by the department. Next slide. The concept of enterprise risk management, a risk-based approach to managing an enterprise, was really first introduced at MnDOT around 2008 formally. For risk, the first step, of course, was to define risk management, and it's very similar to that which was the definition presented by the previous presenter. Risk management analysis is a systematic approach to setting the best course of action under uncertainty by identifying, assessing, understanding, acting on, and communicating risks. Like most DOTs in recent years, investments required to meet existing performance targets have well exceeded projected resources. As a result, MnDOT has begun to formally incorporate risk management into our overall transportation planning process and investment decision-making activities. Where performance measures and targets allow us to quantify how well we are doing at meeting specific objectives, risk management analysis is helping us consider trade-offs among competing objectives when resources are inadequate or there is a high level of uncertainty. Using risk to inform investment and project decisions is certainly not a new concept for MnDOT. However, moving forward, the use of risk management analysis will be more standardized, more transparent, and will be an integral part of investment planning. At MnDOT, it will serve as a starting point for discussions with the public and transportation partners regarding investment decisions and required trade-offs in light of fiscal constraints. Next slide. The evolution of risk management at MnDOT continued through 2010, where we initiated some work to develop what we call district risk profiles. Districts being the geographic areas of the state as defined where we have unique risks. We systematically identified and assessed unique risk conditions at that district level. Some districts, of course, are more urban. Others are certainly more rural. Some have seasonal freight issues or high seasonal recreation-oriented traffic. Others, for example, have poor soils. The list can go on and on. The objective of these profiles was to evaluate how each district, with its unique characteristics, might best respond to statewide investment directions. We were able to identify investment strategies to keep risks at a tolerable level, even given the unique nature of risks as we looked across the state. Completing this risk assessment required several assumptions. For example, we had to assume no change in policy, resource allocation, or system size. We gave guidance that established a 10-year time horizon and standardized impact and probability scales. The output was a profile of risk in the end for each district. And while not included in the slide, it's important to note that we completed a similar risk profile for several of our investment categories, which would include pavement, bridge, safety, and mobility. So it really covered all categories of need across all of the districts. Next slide. The evolution continued, building on the profiles that were developed for each district and the development of our Better Roads program. Our Better Roads program is a great example of how risk management analysis can inform investment decision making. As of 2011, in this state, more than 700 miles of our trunk highways were in poor condition. Despite approximately almost $1 billion of planned pavement investments from 2012 to 2015, the number of miles in poor condition was projected to increase to almost 2,000 miles by the year 2020. Using a risk management analysis process, we were successful at identifying and communicating the likelihood of negative impacts on the traveling public, the state's economy, as well as our quality of life, along with the dramatic increase in the future cost of the deferred maintenance. The result of this risk assessment were used to make the case to our legislature. We were ultimately able to redirect funds to address these needs. Next slide. Continuing the evolution at MnDOT, in 2012, our agency finally formally established the Enterprise Risk Management Office and created for the first time the position of Chief Risk Officer. The ERM office, as we refer to it, is charged with developing, promoting, and managing a formal and continuous process to identify, assess, prioritize, and manage risk exposures and opportunities across the department. In the first days and months of this new Enterprise Risk Management Office, the Chief Risk Officer, Eric Davis, if you ever need to contact him, developed an Enterprise Risk Register, and that initial work identified some 225 risks across this state. That office also took steps through April of this year to establish an enterprise risk management framework and guidance. Next slide. The enterprise risk management framework that I'm referring to applies to the three levels that were communicated by the previous presenter and are very similar, but there's a few word changes that you need to recognize. Where the previous presenter talked about agency level risks, we talk about this in terms of strategic level risks, which impede the achievement of MnDOT's vision, mission, and key results. These are broad strategic risk areas and include financial, stakeholder, reputation, legal, and compliance, as well as safety and health and business performance and continuity risks. Strategic risks are monitored and assessed at both the strategic and business line levels. The business line level, or what in Shabna's presentation was referred to as program level, at MnDOT are identified and managed by business line management. These risks impede the agency's ability to deliver products and services, meet established performance targets, and accomplish our business objectives. And finally, the project level risks are risks identified by our project managers that threaten the scope or the schedule or the cost or quality of our projects. Depending on the scope and complexity of the project, these risks may have strategic or business line consequences that warrant inclusion in the strategic level ERM risk register. The figure that you see on the right of this slide, which may be a little difficult for folks to see, is the MnDOT Integrated Risk Management and Business Planning process. This establishes the standards, the processes, and the accountability structure used to identify, assess, prioritize, and manage key risk exposures across the agency. The framework enables leaders at all levels within MnDOT to systematically evaluate the implications of decisions and actions to the agency's highest priority goals and objectives, or what we call key results areas, and effectively manage a broad array of risks in an informed and strategic manner to within an accepted tolerance level. MnDOT's ERM framework identifies and assesses the risks to achieving the organization's priority business and multimodal investment objectives described as key results areas. MnDOT's senior management identifies performance targets, indicators, and risk tolerance for outcomes associated with each of those key result areas and the targeted outputs of aligned products and services. Next slide. We have been a performance-based planning agency, as I said in my opening remarks, for more than a decade. In part, this means we identify performance measures and targets to quantify needs and develop investment strategies and financial plans for addressing these needs. We are beginning to incorporate risk management analysis into our planning process as well. This will be used as a means to consider trade-offs among competing investment objectives. Our first big opportunity to do this is in our 20-year State Highway Investment Plan, what we call MNSHIP, Minnesota State Highway Investment Plan. The update is currently in progress and scheduled to be complete this late summer, August or so of this year. MNSHIP identifies capital investment priorities based on projected funding for Minnesota's 12,000-mile state highway system. MnDOT updates this plan every 4 years to reflect changes in policy, transportation needs, construction costs, and revenue. Next slide. In this update of MNSHIP, we applied a scenario-based planning methodology to explore the impact of different investment options on system performance and key objectives. We did this both internally and with our public and stakeholders throughout our extensive outreach process. Each of the outcomes that we evaluated were discussed in terms of risk. For each scenario, impacts were described in terms of potential risks managed and outstanding risks accepted. Framing our investment options in terms of risk allowed for a broad set of stakeholders, both internal and external, to participate in a discussion of trade-offs in a more meaningful way than has ever been accomplished historically. Next slide. Finally, in the evolution of risk in the department, we have begun to work with FHWA on the Asset Management Plan pilot project. Minnesota is one of the 3 states participating in this pilot project to develop Transportation Asset Management Plan in accordance with MAP 21. The Federal Highway Administration is working with each of the states, assisting, advising, and no doubt learning the pilot TAMP process as it evolves. The final asset management plan is due to FHWA in April of 2014. As was discussed earlier, MAP 21 requires that at a minimum the asset management plan address pavement and bridges on the national highway system. MnDOT plans to expand the Transportation Asset Management Plan here to include a few other asset management types. Next slide. As a part of its assistance, the FHWA and its consultant developed a draft work plan containing the following sections: the asset inventory and conditions, asset management objectives and measures, performance gap assessment, life cycle cost considerations, risk management analysis, financial plan, investment strategies, as well as asset management process enhancements. As you can see, the risk management analysis is an important piece of this generic sample asset management plan work plan. Within this section, state DOTs are expected to set the context for risk management, define key programmatic risks associated with implementation of the plan, define system risks that could adversely affect the national highway system, provide a map showing the national highway assets most at risk, and finally include a risk register that provides for each programmatic risk the likelihood of occurrence, consequences of occurrence, as well as mitigation activities. Next slide. MnDOT plans to approach asset management for each of the chosen asset types in a systematic way by following the 3 steps listed on this slide. The first step will be to collect and organize all available information on MnDOT's current practice, including how decisions are made with regard to management of each selected asset group. Preliminary work on this documentation has already started. Secondly, establish levels of service, performance measures, as well as targets. This will build on the work of our MnSHIP, our highway investment plan that I talked about earlier. Risk is addressed in steps 3 and 4, in which system risks assessments are conducted within each asset group as well as between or among the various asset groups. The final step for the asset groups will be to develop operations and maintenance plans to minimize life cycle costs and to mitigate identified risks. With better managed, proactive maintenance will come reductions we expect of both cost and risk here at MnDOT. Next slide. That concludes my presentation. I will pass the baton back to Hiana to introduce the next speaker.
Thank you, Tim. And just a reminder to people, if you have any questions of our speakers so far, please type them in at the top, on the top menu bar, and we will take them after our next speaker. So our final presentation is from Florida DOT, and as Anant Prasad, who's the Secretary of Florida DOT, also the chair of the Subcommittee on Asset Management for AASHTO, and now the newly elected chair of the Standing Committee on Performance Management, Florida's risk management program as it pertains to asset management is very much focused on hurricane preparedness. We have 2 speakers for this presentation. Byron Underwood, who is the Emergency Operations Chief, will speak first, followed by Daniel Strickland, who's the Maintenance Contracts Engineer. And they will be speaking to us about FDOT's emergency management program in the context of asset management. I'll turn it over to Byron.
This is Byron Underwood. I am in Fort Lauderdale, Florida, where the weather is very nice today. At the Governor's Hurricane Conference, where emergency managers from all over our state have gathered to prepare and plan and everything that we do, all the good stuff we do when we have a blue sky environment in preparation for those gray sky environments when hurricanes and other disasters may affect the state. This first slide that you see here with the picture there is very indicative of what we deal with here in the state of Florida. Those are hurricane tracks over probably the last 100 years, and you can see that enough of them converge on the state of Florida that it basically blots it from the map. We are ground zero for those hurricane landfalls, and we're very well aware of them. And so a great deal of our effort is concerned with how we manage our response to those types of events. And I'm on the operations side of it, which is basically the tactical response on how we respond to an event after it's happened. But you can see there from that first slide, we are very much engaged in collaborating with all parts of the department, specifically the State Maintenance Office and their contracting unit, to make sure that we have contracts and preparations in place in anticipation of the likelihood of these storms, and that we are able to implement our plans and respond to them, recover from them, and mitigate issues that we may have in the future. And a big part of how we're going to do that is through our asset maintenance contracting. Next slide, please. From the preparedness side, and what I want to note here is these issues are what we would refer to as the 4 pillars in emergency management. It comes out of the National Incident Management System, the National Response Framework, and in Florida we follow those models very closely and carefully. And preparedness is probably the first pillar of emergency management. And some of those activities that we engage in with preparation include the review and update of all our emergency documents and procedures and contracts and whatnot regarding them, planning, evacuation routes, damage assessment procedures and policies, update training, pre-event contracts, and Daniel's going to talk a little bit more about those here in just a few minutes. And how we coordinate with not only the locals, but also our federal partners to make sure that everybody understands what all those federal guidelines are, so that when we do respond, that we are able to recover those funds that we had to expend, which can be quite costly. Next slide, please. Again, just prior to the event, we have executed our pre-event contract. We have vendors that are out there handling this part of the state. We do not have the manpower here. We certainly don't have it in emergency management. We look at ourselves as not the rowers of the boat, but we're the steerers of the boat. And so we are constantly trying to prepare our equipment and personnel through vendors and whatnot who are going to respond and provide those resources that will be necessary. Again, we use a lot of volunteers here in the state of Florida as a force multiplier to ramp up to the necessary staff that we have to respond to these events, many which last for months at a time, those response phases. We pre-stage critical teams when we know where these storms are coming in as they get close, so that they can move in right behind the storm and respond as quickly as possible. Some of the activities that we engage in that preparedness measures, be closing of bridges and dropping high mast lighting and a lot of things of this nature. And then once the emergency declaration process has occurred, then we will start responding and shifting over into those regional, state, and federal assets that may be available to us to manage that event. Next slide, please. As we enter that response phase, both during and after the event, as we start responding, we are performing initial damage assessment. This typically comes in what we call through the use of our recon teams or reconnaissance teams. DOT does reconnaissance every day. We're getting calls through our TMCs on where accidents have occurred or where bridges have been struck and whatnot. So we do it every day. But when we have one of these major events, it's just like ramping an emergency up and putting it on steroids. There's just a lot more of it over a much larger area. And so we have to quickly perform our reconnaissance efforts to kind of get an idea on establishing priorities on what problems we're going to respond to first, second, and third, so that we can begin restoring the normal infrastructure as quickly as possible. Most of our emergency repairs are not covered under our regular pre-existing asset maintenance contract. In the past, they were covered that way. We got away from that because of the fact that we had 8 storms hit the state over a 2-year period of time, and we were charged with by some of the federal partners that kind of redoing some of these things, and it's been a mixed blessing. We would like to kind of return to that so we know who those vendors are going to be, what they're going to do, combine our contracts, and simply switch on the correct deliverables as they become appropriate or necessary. We're working with local governments over eligible reimbursements. We do that through the emergency management system when those mission requests are cast by the local governments, and as they come up through our regional, or in Florida, we call them our FDOT districts, who oversee that, confer with it, and then we work with our federal partners at Federal Highway Administration and FEMA to make sure that we're going to get reimbursed for those large projects when they get done to the extent possible. We're going to take care of that problem no matter what, but we would like to get our money back, or that money back if it's at all possible. Next slide, please. This is an example of what happens after a storm if we have to go fill up large potholes. This model here describes how we will be paid for that effort, whether it's a FEMA reimbursement or a federal highway. We map this out so we can help our volunteers and leadership and everybody else kind of understand this process. It looks like some sort of a Rube Goldberg contraption, and it's not always the easiest thing to understand, especially when you are trying to address the reimbursement issue several years after the storm has passed and piece together why you did what you did. In trying to explain this a little bit better, sometimes it's easier when I'm talking with legislative people, working on legislative committees, or different individuals who are not always transportation officials. If you look at what we do, it's basically like a managed care model for a health situation. A lot of people are familiar with HMOs and how they operate and work. You have a primary physician who attends you or your family's needs, and that's kind of what our pre-existing contracts with the asset maintenance contractors do. They take care of the repairing light bulbs and replacing signs that get blown down and filling potholes and those types of activities. But when a major health condition would present itself, your primary man will refer you to a specialist. And that's what we do over in emergency management. We specialize in handling those bigger ticket items that are over a larger geographic area than what that contractor himself and people themselves may deal with. The problem often comes in, and not with the physicians attending you, but whether your insurance company will pay for whatever that specialist wants to do. And that's where we come in as emergency managers on the operations side, is we basically become the case management expert for our patient, and that patient being that corridor that requires the attention and assistance. And what we do is we make sure that our physicians are doing what they need to do, because that's what they do best. And what we do best is to make sure that the proper documentation, paperwork, everything else that's necessary to expedite the operation and the additional resources, assets that may be necessary to complete those operations are provided, and we can recover as much of the cost to the greatest extent possible. Next slide, please. So the asset maintenance contracting, we are looking at new ways to approach this and deal with it. We're looking at long-term performance-based contracting, which encompasses all or most maintenance functions on a day-to-day basis to keep our patient healthy, to keep the public safe and maintain the roadways within these specific corridors. We call it asset management, that's asset maintenance. Next slide.
Byron, let me mention one thing.
Yes.
Good afternoon. This is Daniel Strickland. I work in the state maintenance office, and I primarily am responsible for performance-based, and we call it asset maintenance contracting. I just wanted to say one thing, Byron, before we move on. Florida has been basically mandated to basically outsource 90% of our maintenance budget to the private sector. So in the future, we will be impacted greatly specific to asset maintenance and our performance-based contracting methods. Specific to risk management, we have to incorporate that as well as incorporating the emergency side of it into these contracts and the great deal of risk associated with those. Florida has great accolades in this performance-based contracting. Industry has praised us for having the best, most concept-embracing program in the nation. We've received many requests locally and internationally each year asking for various types of information on how to build and conduct an effective asset maintenance program. And we've made great strides in the recent past to move forward and get past some of these hurdles specific to the federal guidelines and others. And we can go into a little bit more of that in the next couple slides. So go ahead, Byron.
Okay, got here. The next slide says asset maintenance contract. Like we mentioned earlier, in Florida they formally included all incidents, events, anything that happened in a particular corridor, including hurricane response and recovery. Now they only include those things that would happen under a blue sky situation, just regular routine maintenance and operations and whatnot, because we require separate contracts to handle those activities that would ensue following a large event like a hurricane. And the question is why. Next slide. Overall, asset maintenance contractors do very well for us here in disaster response cleanup in the past. They're already mobilized. They have an abundant amount of resources. They have extensive knowledge and experience over the roadways and corridors that they have been maintaining on a day-to-day basis. They know where their problem areas are. The great majority of the work was federal highway and or FEMA reimbursable. Tremendous amounts of paperwork are involved, documentation, red tape involved in getting the federal money to the contractor. It's always a challenge. We go back to our Rube Goldberg diagram a few minutes ago. In some cases, the contractors did not see federal money for over 2 years. Under that model, the federal, those providers were attempting to recover the money from the federal partner. This may have been possible to some extent from federal highways. It was probably not possible from FEMA. And that's where we come in the emergency management operations through our mission tasking and whatnot, is justifying, documenting, authenticating, ordering those assets, and providing that paper trail, which will allow the state to be reimbursed after those contractors have been paid. Next slide. Some of the cause and why we got away from what we used to do and where we are today is, like I mentioned previously, we had 8 hurricane landfalls over a 2-year period of time. Certainly no one was ready for that. No single entity is really at fault. Everyone has shared responsibility in this, from the state agency to the contractors to the federal partners. And it's often very difficult to deal with it. Some of our folks over at the Division of Emergency Management here in the state of Florida, since over the last 8 years, since 2004, we've experienced a lot of turnover in staff over there, and you end up losing a lot of your historical knowledge and whatnot on how to do these things and how to improve them. But it seems like we're constantly going back to the beginning and starting over again. There was not as much consistency in the documentation and the requirements. Everybody's kind of operating on what they think the other fellow needs, and they're doing the best they can, and you really don't find out whether or not it was adequate enough for maybe several years when the folks that are paying the bills are asking you for additional documentation or try to explain what happened and who did what and why they did what they did well after the fact. Next slide. Like we say, in some cases the contractor didn't see the money. Now we would be reimbursing them directly for that, and the state agency would be seeking reimbursement from FEMA and the Federal Highway. It required a major overhaul of our scope to exclude post-event activity. It requires special contracts now in the event that a large disaster were to occur. We would be out contracting with those folks separately to do it. One of the things that we are discussing with the State Maintenance Office and their contracting unit is to try to see if we can return to those days where we have a combined contract situation because we know who the contractors are, we're familiar with them, they're familiar with the scope related to a particular corridor, and they are already operational in that area and well able to respond. So we want to see what we can do to clean up the paperwork a little bit and let everybody get back to doing what they do best. And that's where our contracting comes in. Next slide, please. Daniel put this slide together, and to me, it's one of the more powerful slides that we have in our presentation because it just clearly outlines what we used to do and what we're doing now in response to some of these asset maintenance strategies and mitigation strategies and response strategies that we operate from the emergency management side. And you can see what some of those things are. Basically, some of the highlights here are we have moved to where we categorize these things currently in two classifications. One would be, for lack of a better term, what happens during the blue sky period and what happens during the gray sky period. If we've had a government declaration, then how do we perform that second contract? We've tried to more clearly define the scope of work, as these typically are fixed price contracts, but most of the work is done up front in trying to develop the scope of work and the deliverables and how much is to be paid for them. We've added a contra flow component. That means basically reverse landing of a large interstate or turnpike system here in Florida to when a mass evacuation may be ordered. We basically tabletop or sometimes we field exercise that to make sure that we're able to pull that off if we have to do that. And the contractors are now responsible and compensated for acts of terrorism. And some of the other language that's there. Next slide, please. So the plan is we're currently coordinating with the feds to allow for either of the following: either modify our existing scope to become federally approved and eligible for reimbursement. Now, this is an issue that we are working with Federal Highway on specifically. We've already received very favorable response from them, very, very cooperative, in that we want them to look at some of these combined contracts, and when we shift over from our day-to-day efforts that are not necessarily, and those contracts are not necessarily federalized, that when we switch on those activities that would occur during or following a disaster, that what goes along with those new deliverables are also the assurances that basically federalize those contracts. For example, Davis-Bacon wage rates and those types of things that will enable the Fed to reimburse us without any undue delay. And or to utilize the asset maintenance contractors to manage and administer repair work and whatnot that they do normally. So we're trying to combine these efforts to make for a more seamless, coordinated approach to our management of these large events that affect the state. Next slide, please. Daniel, if you've got anything to add, please do so. Kind of clarify what we talked about here. And from my side, with emergency management, if anybody has any questions outside of this discussion that we're having here today, I would be more than happy to discuss it with them over the telephone, or they can send an email request on how we do this in Florida, and I'll be happy to share any and all materials that we have with them. So, Daniel, I'll turn it over to you.
Okay, yeah, just real briefly, the problem we face is that when the feds found out that our asset maintenance contractors, in the contract scope, they were required to handle all events, all emergencies, incidents that occur, no matter the size, the significance, and all of that. So when they found out that they were going to have to handle that, regardless of whether they were eligible for reimbursements or whether they're going to be reimbursed or not, I guess that was the trouble we faced, because they then said, well, we won't reimburse you then. So the issue we had was we had to totally revamp our scope, take all of the response and the emergency management side of it out, with the exception of those things prior to the event, safing up anything, lowering high mast lights and that sort of thing. They still continue to do that, but that's not what we want. We want it to be a performance-based contract so that they handle everything. They manage the risk, which we do incorporate several risk factors in our scope. One being, for a single incident, there's $1 million cap. So if a bridge were to get hit or washed out by storm surge or whatever, the contractor's not at full risk. We'll take that risk on, because with risk, as you know, is also a cost associated with that. So, our bids would be higher if we didn't account for this risk. So we want to do that. We want to manage these risks, but do it in a way that the contractor, because they do it so well, they know the risk involved. They know what to expect, and they can certainly do it in a very capable way. So that's really it. But what we're trying to do now is move, kind of where we used to be, and let the contractor handle the reimbursements, let them do all the work, let them take care of pretty much everything we would do as an agency. And that's what our coordinating efforts with the federal government is to try to go back in that direction. And that's pretty much a summary of how we handle that at the Florida Department of Transportation. And again, if there's any questions, here's our contact information as well.
Thank you, Dan and Byron. So if people have questions right now, please type it into the Q&A part of the menu bar on the top. If you have specific questions to each of the speakers, they can be answered now, or we can make sure you get connected to them. And as you can see, Byron and Dan's contact information is there. So with that, let's start with the first question, which comes from Alan Ward. And this is a question for Gordon. And he's asking, regarding policy risks, how important is it for risk registers and other supporting documents to be part of the public record? While he realizes that transparency of decision-making is a popular consideration, the political environment for a DOT may not always be conducive to a high level of transparency. Are confidential risk assessments still a sound option? Gordon?
Sure, yeah, that's a great question. I could see where, particularly if you have personnel matters involved, say you're not comfortable with a program manager, that may be a real risk, that you may not want that in your risk register. So, it's an excellent question. And personnel and, say, contractual questions with contractors, such as in Florida, may well need to be excluded. I think the intent of the policy risks is to try to communicate to the legislature and others that while you may have the best of intentions to carry out the policies they want you to, that there are certain things you can't control. and that the risk policy risk register can allow a tool to communicate to them that you've thought these things through and that you're actively trying to overcome them. When I was unmuting myself here, I missed part of your question, Yana, so I may not have totally answered everything he asked. Could you elaborate on the rest of the question and anything that I didn't cover there?
Let's see. So he's asking, are confidential, did you get that, confidential risk assessment still a sound option? So he's really asking in terms of transparency, what's the right dynamic between transparency and confidentiality when you're dealing with risk management?
Yeah, that's a very sophisticated question, and we're at the early stages of risk management. But I'd have to say, in terms of personnel or contractual disputes, those may well want to be kept out of your risk register. But the others, I think, intended to be a frank assessment that certain things could impede our policy objectives and us achieving the things that our bosses want us to. And we're trying to get those onto the record. We're trying to show that we have thought them through and evaluated them, that we're actively monitoring them. But it may occur that our objectives may well be imperiled.
Thanks, Gordon. All right, our next question is from Guy Tremblay, and it's to Tim Henkel. And the question is, how do you communicate the risk to the population in order to be as transparent as possible? What is the reaction? How to deal with the social acceptability of risk? Tim?
Well, the simple answer is probably it goes against Gordon's last remarks. Transparency is critical. Risk registers are the communication device, and it's as simple as that. The DOT here develops a risk register. It oftentimes makes the early stages of that risk register work confidential, but once that risk register is completed, it's the vehicle to communicate very clearly what risks we face so that those stakeholders can help us to address those risks as much as the department addresses risks that are specific to what we can control.
Thanks, Tim. So that concludes the Q&A, and if anybody wants to ask further questions, please feel free to type in their questions, and we will follow up with the presenters. Thank you to all of our presenters. That was a terrific set of presentations. I think we all are leaving today's webinar with a greater understanding of risk management and asset management. Okay, so just before we sign off here, the next 4 webinars are now scheduled, and here is the list of them. The first one, which will be the 5th webinar in the series, will be on July 10th, and it's on asset management and performance-based planning. The one after that will be on September 18th, addressing preservation and maintenance in asset management plans. And that will be actually a report out from the Subcommittee on Maintenance and the Asset Management Subcommittee joint meeting in Burlington that Matt mentioned at the beginning of the webinar. Then the third in the next set will be on November 13th, and it will be asset management and adaptation to climate change and extreme weather events. And then the fourth in the next set will be on January 22nd on data needs, issues, and governance for improved management of highway assets. If any of you have great ideas for presentations or experiences that you've had related to the topics, please let Matt or Steve Gay or myself know. The other is if you want for the next set of 4 that will start in March of 2014, if you have ideas for or suggestions for webinars, please send them along as well. So with that, thank you very much, and we look forward to for your participation on the next one on July 10th. Thank you. Goodbye, everyone.